I've never read this one, so it's going to be a cold read for me. But this is on the horror list, so this is where we're going to start today. So here we are, SCP-3673. Object Class, Euclid. The building containing SCP-3673 is to be sealed and guarded, with the cover story of a failed restoration project. The door to SCP-3673 remains closed and barricaded. All footage recorded by the camera in SCP-3673 will be retained for analysis. A second camera is to be installed to film through the windows into SCP-3673. Security personnel are advised to ignore any noises audible from SCP-3673. Further experimentation is pending Level 4 approval. We have a picture, a view of SCP-3673 after the disappearance of Drone 2B. Note distortions in the layout, duplication of the interior, and the absence of windows. Description. SCP-3673 is Studio 5C of the Redacted Arts Building, located in Lower Manhattan. The room is located on the 5th floor and was used as a ballet studio. It contains a mirrored wall with ballet bar, roof-level windows on the northern side, and a single door. There are no other exits. On or about July 7th, 2016, SCP-3673 became the locus of a spatial anomaly. Since this time, when the door to SCP-3673 is closed, all persons inside appear to be affected by spatial distortions and related phenomena. These phenomena cannot be observed from outside SCP-3673. When the door to SCP-3673 is closed, no communication is possible with persons inside the studio. The room appears empty when viewed through the exterior windows. No persons who have been subject to the anomaly have been recovered. The only information about the anomalous conditions within SCP-3673 is from a CCTV camera located in the upper northwest corner of the room. The camera records black and white video, but not sound. From this camera, the majority of the studio may be observed, including when the door is closed. We have an addendum, a video transcript. Note, the transcript is of the CCTV recording from SCP-3673 on the afternoon of the 7th of July, 2016, the first recorded occurrence of the anomaly. 15 girls, aged 7 to 9, dressed in leotards and slippers, are participating in a ballet lesson. The lesson is conducted by a woman identified as Chloe Saunier, a 45-year-old teacher at the Redacted College of Arts. An assistant sits at a chair, operating a tape player. She has been identified as Emily Parker, an 18-year-old student at the college. The lesson ends. The girls huddle in groups, talking and laughing. Saunier opens the studio door. Parents come in to collect their daughters. 10 minutes after the lesson ends, 4 children remain in the studio. They have been identified as Rebecca Jones, Amy Chang, Kayla Okonjo, and Elizabeth Telford. Chang and Telford are laying down, looking at Telford's smartphone. Okonjo is practicing her arabesque in front of the mirror. Jones is reading by herself, seated facing a corner of the room. Saunier finishes speaking to parents in the doorway. She walks back into the studio and the door closes behind her. Okonjo begins to rehearse her pirouette. As she turns, her grounded foot sinks slightly into the wooded floor of the studio. On her final turn, her image in the mirror stops moving. The other reflections continue motion as normal. When Okonjo spins to face the mirror, her reflection resumes synchronization, and her toe is once again grounded on the studio floor. Parker speaks to Chang and Telford, who laugh in response and resume watching Telford's phone. Parker moves back to place her chair against the studio wall. Saunier is making notes in a notebook on the far side of the room. Okonjo is looking at one end of the mirrored wall nearer to the studio door. She walks towards that edge of the mirror. As she reaches forward, it becomes apparent that the last panel of the mirror is recessed. Okonjo leans into the recess, looking behind the other mirrors. She walks into this passage, disappearing from view. The scene outside the studio windows briefly changes to resemble a heavy snowstorm, then reverts to normal. Only Parker notices. She walks towards the wall with the windows, craning her neck up to see through them. Jones remains reading, but drifts slowly along the floorboards towards the wall. She does not react. Saunier begins walking across the studio towards the door. Despite her walking speed, she does not make appreciable progress across the room. She increases her pace without obvious effect. Okonjo walks out from behind the mirrors and calls to Chang and Telford. Chang and Telford walk towards the recessed mirrors. Okonjo again disappears into the darkened passageway. Chang puts her arm around Telford's shoulder as she walks. Her elbow remains in a fixed position in space, and her lower and upper arms lengthen accordingly as she crosses the room. The lengthened arm does not appear to have an internal skeletal structure falling to the floor in loops. Neither girl notices. What? Saunier runs across the studio with limited forward progress. She is visibly concerned. She looks around the room but does not appear to see any other person. Saunier trips and falls, causing minor abrasions to her lower arms. The floor of the studio has become irregular and rough where she is lying. Saunier stands up and continues towards the door. Jones, still reading, has tilted to a 30-degree incline against the wall. Parker backs slowly away from the windows to change her viewing angle. There is a small chip in the wooden floor behind her. As she steps backward, the gap in the floor widens and deepens. Space cannot be seen. When Chang is approximately 2 meters from the mirror, her extended arm snaps rapidly back into place. She does not react. When Chang and Telford reach the mirror, the area previously recessed is now flat with the remainder of the mirror. Chang and Telford press onto the glass. Their reflections press back. The floor in Saunier's path is becoming increasingly irregular, with sharp protrusions up to 1 meter in height. Saunier continues clambering forward. Telford steps away from the mirror and begins sinking into the studio floor. Telford screams and Chang grabs at her shoulders. Telford sinks rapidly to her waist. Parker turns at the sound of the scream and sees the chasm that has opened up beyond her. She shouts, but keeps her balance. Panicked, Parker attempts to make a call from her cell phone, but is not successful. Chang manages to pull Telford free of the studio floor. They sit for a moment, breathing heavily. Chang points in the direction of the far wall. Telford calls out in that direction, then both girls run towards and through the wall. Saunier reaches the studio door, but is unable to open it. She hits the door with her fists. Shadows are visible in the mirror. Parker walks back towards the wall with windows and reacts in surprise. She begins to step upwards, apparently climbing a staircase, which is invisible to the camera. Saunier turns from the door and sees Jones, who remains reading, situated halfway up the wall. Saunier calls out to Jones, who does not respond. Telford and Chang reemerge from the far wall, each smiling and holding a stalk of wheat or barley. They are accompanied by and speaking with Okonjo. Okonjo's teeth and sclera are several shades darker than before, and her knees now bend backwards, changing her gait. These alterations are not shown in Okonjo's reflection. Saunier leaves the door, attempting to walk towards Jones, who has drifted towards the ceiling. Saunier regularly changes direction, stops in confusion, and backtracks, as if walking through a maze. Her progress is limited. Parker reaches the top of the invisible staircase and is adjacent to the windows through which the afternoon sky can be seen. She slides one window open. Beyond it is darkness. Parker leans her head out of the window. Telford, Chang, and Okonjo walk to an area in the center of the studio. They observe a shimmering sphere, approximately 30 centimeters in radius, centered 1 meter above the floor. Telford removes her ballet slipper and cautiously pushes it into the sphere. The slipper's shape is heavily distorted, and Telford drops it in shock. It returns to its previous shape as it falls from the space. Parker leans further through the window, then crawls out along an unseen surface beyond the window. She continues crawling until out of sight. The window slides shut behind her. Jones, still reading, drifts back towards her original position. Chang and Telford experiment with the spatial anomaly. Their ballet slippers and hair clips change shape and dimensions inside it before returning to normal when removed. Chang's hand accidentally slips into the space, and its fingers become grossly distended. She shrieks and pulls her hand out, at which point it returns to its normal size and shape. Chang and Telford laugh. Okonjo ceases to react to the other girls and becomes slowly more and more transparent. Saunier has returned to the studio door. Okonjo steps out from the passageway in front of the recessed mirror, looking confused. She sees Sonye. The Okonjo in the center of the studio has now faded completely. The window in the top corner of the studio begins to slide open. Chang and Telford are still playing with the distorted space, pushing their arms and feet into it and attempting to make shapes with their hands. Jones has returned to her original position in the corner of the room. Okonjo and Sonye call and run towards each other. Parker's head emerges from the sliding window into the studio. She sighs and looks to her left. Okonjo runs through Sonye. Both turn in confusion. The sliding window slams shut. Parker is decapitated. Telford pokes her head into the spatial anomaly and collapses. Parker's head falls through the floor of the studio. Telford convulses on the ground. Chang stares in shock. Okonjo takes 2 steps back towards Sonye, then suddenly falls upward, flying through the studio ceiling. Sonye screams. Parker's head drops down through the studio ceiling above Chang and lands heavily on the floor at her feet. Chang panics, running towards the mirror and through it. The floor near Sonye vibrates as if hit from below by a heavy object. Sonye jumps, startled. Blood begins to seep upward through the floor. Sonye looks around wildly, then grabs the handle to the studio door. Chang is briefly visible within the mirror. She stands motionless, facing the room. A reflective liquid seeps from her open eyes and mouth. The door to the studio opens inward, the opposite direction to its hinge's design. Sonye peers behind it, then is abruptly pulled through it by an unseen force. The studio door swings shut. Chang's body in the mirror fades from view. Jones is alone in the studio. She continues to read, oblivious. The door closes. The camera's view becomes completely black for 3 seconds. When visuals return, Jones remains reading. A body, dressed in Sonye's clothes, is lying on the studio floor, 5 meters behind her. The front of the head has been subjected to repeated blunt force trauma. The head of a large sledgehammer is resting in the remains of the face. Jones turns the page of her book. The mirrored wall recedes to an estimated distance of 500 meters. The bar remains suspended in place and begins to writhe slowly. Behind Jones, the arms of the corpse move, grasping the handle of the sledgehammer and lifting it out of the face. The body stands upright as if pulled. Viscous droplets of liquid spill from the hole in the front of its head. The corpse walks towards Jones, raising the sledgehammer. The girl continues reading. CCTV signal cut. The Foundation has determined that at the time of the loss of the signal from the camera, the father of Rebecca Jones had opened the door to SCP-3673 and had entered the studio. Finding the studio empty, Mr. Jones left to look elsewhere for his daughter. The door to SCP-3673 did not close until Mr. Jones exited, at which point the CCTV signal resumed, showing an empty studio. We have addendum to, English is hard, D-class testing. Now, we did not go over this last time, so you may not be familiar with the concept of D-class. But basically, because most of the things that the SCP Foundation deals with are dangerous, in some cases ridiculously so, they need a steady supply of test material. D-class are prisoners or other such dejects from society. Different stories and different canons have different kinds of people associated with D-class. Mostly it's assumed that in most cases these are death row inmates, people who are slated for removal anyway. They are used when the life of a scientist or investigator from the SCP Foundation would be too high a risk for these experimentations. So here we are. We're throwing a D-class at the problem. Addendum 2, D-class training. Exploration and testing of the anomaly using drones was unsuccessful, as transmission of signal to or from SCP-3673 was not possible when the door was closed. D-Class testing was approved on the 2nd of February, 2018. Note, this is about a year and a half after the initial incident. D-4739 was instructed to enter SCP-3673, wait until the door was closed, then walk around the edge of the studio, keeping one hand on the wall, eventually returning to the door. The D-Class enters SCP-3673 and turns left, placing his left hand on the wall. The observation team closes the studio door. The D-Class walks slowly along the edge of the studio, continuing to touch the wall with his left hand. The reflection in the mirrored wall shows an empty room. As the D-Class reaches the corner of the room, he turns 90 degrees left instead of right. However, instead of facing the wall to his left, the D-Class finishes by facing in the correct direction to proceed along the next wall. Slow motion analysis of the camera footage cannot determine whether this is caused by the studio rotating around the D-Class's position or by the D-Class's body turning through itself. The D-Class's left hand remains in contact with the wall at all times. Halfway along the second wall, the D-Class falls into a section of floor which is visually normal but immaterial. The D-Class's torso lands on solid floor next to this area, and he holds himself in place with his legs extending into the floor. Simultaneously, a pair of legs resembling those of the D-Class come down through the ceiling in the center of the studio. The D-Class sees the legs extending from the ceiling and laughs. The D-Class moves his torso, and the legs move in concert, swinging and kicking. After approximately 1 minute, the D-Class pulls himself out of the intangible floor. The legs in the ceiling do not retract and remain visible, swaying and kicking intermittently. The D-Class appears concerned, turns, and attempts to retrace his route to the studio door. Despite walking forward, the D-Class moves backwards, traveling in his original direction around the room. The D-Class stops walking as he reaches the next corner of the room beneath the studio windows. The D-Class attempts to jump upwards to reach the windows. With each jump, the height of the studio wall increases until the walls are approximately 20 meters above the studio floor. The position of the camera, the ceiling, including the legs, and the height of the other walls of the studio remain unchanged. The D-Class proceeds along the wall beneath the windows. 2/3 of the way along this wall, the D-Class turns and runs towards the middle of the studio. After approximately 3 meters, the D-Class disappears. The final frame of the CCTV footage prior to the D-Class's disappearance showed that his body's distended in 2 distinct directions. Review of the preceding frame suggests that immediately prior, his hair and loose items of clothing were pulled towards these same locations. The observation team's leading hypothesis is that this may have been caused by the gravitational effects of 2 separate points of exceptionally high density within SCP-3673. The model is unable to account for the fact that neither light nor the structure of the studio were affected by such gravitational forces. The legs protruding from the ceiling of SCP-3673 remain in place, moving occasionally, until the door to the studio is next opened. Addendum 3. Exploration Log. So, in standard SCP fashion, when a D-Class dies or is lost in the course of doing business, as happens pretty much every time you send a D-Class anywhere, the next step is to send MTF involved. MTF, Mobile Task Force, are trained paramilitary soldiers who are generally trained for specific kinds of things. The specific MTF groups are given specific kinds of training, and most of them have names that are associated with their skill set. A manned exploration of SCP-3673 was authorized on October 12th, 2018. Note, this is about 10 months after the D-Class's disappearance, and over 2 years after the initial disappearance, after the initial incident involving the children. 3 members of MTF Zeta-9, the Mole Rats, were selected for the mission. Task Force members were briefed on the likely conditions within SCP-3673 and informed of the location of the CCTV camera. The initial mission parameters were to proceed to the center of the room, remain stationary for 3 minutes, then return to the door, and exit. Agents were equipped with standard exploration equipment, including torches, ropes, navigation tools, and rations for approximately 2 weeks. MTF agents enter SCP-3673 and the studio door is closed. Agent Alpha indicates to the CCTV camera the GPS trackers are operating normally. Agent Beta erects a for-sale rig. We have a note here. A human figurine hung from a telescopic pole ahead of the lead agent, used to detect areas of dimensional instability in the MTF's path. It's basically a canary in a mine shaft. And takes point. The agents proceed slowly towards the center of the studio. Agent Gamma at the rear marks their path using fluorescent spray paint. No anomalies are detected. The mirrored wall reflects images normally. Upon reaching the center of the room, Agent Alpha signals to the CCTV camera. The MTF waits. After 3 minutes, the agents confer, then begin to walk back across the studio. Agent Gamma marks the return path next to the paint marks from the team's entry. During this journey, the agents become subject to a time and/or distance dilation. They take more than 6 minutes to travel a distance of approximately 15 meters based on SCP-3673's external measurements. Agent Alpha indicates awareness of the situation and that the studio door remains visible. Approximately 2 meters from the door, Agent Beta strikes a barrier which cannot be seen on camera. The for-sale rig is not impeded by this barrier. Agent Beta reaches out to touch the barrier, suggesting that it cannot be seen from within SCP-3673. The for-sale rig is retrieved from beyond the barrier without incident. The agents test the barrier, which does not block their equipment, but is impermeable to their bodies. After some discussion, the agents spread out to the left and right, continuing to test the barrier. It appears to be a flat surface blocking the entire width of 3673. Agent Alpha indicates to the camera a change of mission parameters, pointing to the studio windows on the opposite wall. The MTF regroups and walks across the studio. After another 5 minutes of walking, Agent Beta is blocked by a second unseen barrier, located approximately 4 meters from the opposite wall of the studio. Testing suggests that the barrier is also intangible to non-living materials, but impassable by humans. The agents return towards the door. At a point approximately 6 meters away from the studio door, the agents again strike the first invisible barrier. Agent Gamma attempts to mark the barrier with paint, but the paint sprays through without impediment. Agent Beta disassembles the for-sale rig and pushes the telescopic rod towards the door, but it is now too far away to reach. Agent Alpha stands stationary with hands pressed on the barrier. Both hands are slowly but perceptibly pushed backwards. Agent Alpha calls to the other agents, and all three press against the barrier without visible changes to its motion. Agent Beta discharges their firearm at the barrier without result and is reprimanded by Agent Alpha. Agent Alpha points to the mirrored wall of the studio and distributes cutting tools from Gamma's backpack. Agent Gamma moves to the mirrored wall, and Agents Alpha and Beta attempt to cut through the floor in the center of the studio. Their progress is slow. Agent Alpha breaks off work to check the gap between the barriers, which are now less than 3 meters apart. Agent Alpha turns to the camera and indicates a request for assistance. The observation team seeks permission to intervene. Agent Gamma calls Agent Alpha over to the mirrored wall. Agent Gamma has cut a hole as deep as their forearm, but the entire depth of the hole is glass, with no change in composition. After discussion, both agents return to the center of the studio. Researcher Jansen obtains permission to open the door to 3673. Researcher Jansen stands in the doorway but does not enter 3673. On camera, Researcher Jansen is visible in the open doorway. Agents Alpha and Gamma can see Researcher Jansen begin shouting and banging on the barrier. Researcher Johnson reports that SCP-3673 is empty. This observation is corroborated by other researchers present. The barriers are less than 2 meters apart. Agent Beta successfully cuts a hole in the studio floor. While Agents Beta and Gamma enlarge the hole, Agent Alpha secures a rope and drops one end through. The room below SCP-73, a musical rehearsal space, can be seen through the hole. The barriers are approximately 1.5 meters apart. Agent Beta attempts to reach through the hole in the floor and is prevented by another invisible barrier. Neither the cutting tools nor the rope are affected. Agent Beta exhibits distress and draws their firearm. Agent Alpha knocks it away, and it falls outside of the barrier. When the barriers are approximately 1 meter apart, Agent Beta places hands on both barriers and pushes outward to no effect. Agents Gamma and Alpha attempt to climb upwards towards the ceiling. They successfully affix a rope to a ceiling panel and begin cutting. When the barriers are approximately 75 centimeters apart, Gamma holds their position near the ceiling by bracing their back and legs on the barrier. There is limited room to wield the cutting tool, slowing progress. Agent Alpha stands below, speaking and passing further items up. Several pieces of equipment are now outside the barriers and have become irretrievable. Agent Beta paces back and forth at one end of the gap, occasionally banging on the mirrored wall. When the barriers are approximately 50 centimeters apart, Agent Gamma falls, grabbing at the rope and pulling it loose from the ceiling. Alpha helps them upright. After some discussion, the agents reach a decision. Alpha draws their firearm and shoots Gamma in the head, then discharges the weapon into their own head. Both agents slump, but are held partially upright by the barriers. When the barriers are approximately 25 centimeters apart, Agent Beta's movement is severely restricted. They attempt to move towards the center of the room, screaming continuously. The barriers press into Agent Beta's forehead, chest, thighs, back, and the back of Agent Beta's head. The barriers continue to move inward. Agent Beta's head suffers what appears to be a severe, depressed skull fracture in the occipital and parietal bones. Agent Beta loses consciousness. Cerebrospinal fluid leaks from Agent Beta's ears. The barriers continue to move inward. Further fractures occur to a number of Beta's ribs and to the pelvic bone. Similar injuries occur to the bodies of Alpha and Gamma. Several fractured bones pierce the skin, causing substantial bleeding into the space between the barriers. The agents' skulls suffer further severe fractures. As the barriers move closer, the agents' clothing begins to fall loose outside the barriers as their bodies are held within. Various elements of the agents' bodies are subject to compression and torsional forces, causing tearing and bursting of the epidermis and exposure of internal organs. Significant loss of blood and other fluid occurs, but muscle and other tissues are held suspended by the pressure of the barriers. When the barriers are less than 5 centimeters apart, most tissue has been damaged by compression into unrecognizability. Small pieces of intact bone and cartilage can be identified within the suspended pulp, including one of Agent Beta's ears. The continuing inward pressure of the barrier spreads the agent remains upward and outward, with liquids on the studio floor likewise forced upwards to form a dark, translucent paste. At an estimated separation of less than 0.1 centimeters, the barriers cease movement. A thin wall of organic matter remains visible on the CCTV camera for several weeks until permission is granted to close the door to SCP-3673. Subsequently, the camera view shows an empty, intact studio. Damn. Rip. Sucks to be an MTF agent. Update. 17th of January, 2019. Security personnel guarding the entrance to 3673 reported hearing knocking and thumping sounds coming from the other side of the studio door. The noises ceased after approximately 20 minutes. The CCTV camera feed showed nothing visible within the SCP. Containment procedures have been updated. That includes the note that and stationed. So that's where they updated that the station members should ignore any sounds. Update, 11th of February. A routine external survey of the building alerted the research team to change conditions inside 3673. Large letters had been sprayed on the floor of the studio using fluorescent orange paint. The letters faced the windows and read "Don't TR" with the last letter misshapen as if rushed. The letters were accompanied by a series of 6 handprints made using the same fluorescent paint. The prints were clearly defined, regularly spaced, and appeared to be from the left hands of distinct individuals. 3 of the handprints were child-sized. None of these markings were visible on the CCTV camera feed, which showed 3673 empty. Deliberations are ongoing as to whether to reopen the studio door. And that's it. That's the end of that story. Don't TR.